It's Nelle Hotchkiss. She's Chief Operating Officer, North Carolina Electric Membership Corporation. This role, Nelle capitalizes on her more than 20 years of experience and expertise in the utility industry to serve electric cooperatives throughout the state. She's responsible for overseeing the association's statewide activities, including Carolina Country Magazine, Government Affairs, Member Services, Communications, Job Training, Safety, and the TSC Services and a Market Research Organization. Nelle, if you would lead us into this segment, thank you for being with us, and thank you for sponsoring.
Well, thank you, David. It's exciting to be with you today. I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote this morning, Sushma Masemore, and I want to congratulate her on the opportunity that she has now as a promotion to the acting assistant secretary, as well as the state energy director. So two dual roles right now with North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And that also includes the state energy office. We've just heard from our opening comments, the intersection of energy and economic development is incredibly important. And both Carolinas have done well in this area in the past. In discussing the Secretary Masemore's background, she's worked on clean energy solutions and sustainable practices throughout her career with North Carolina businesses, our citizens, and certainly government organizations and operations. Currently, she oversees programs related to low-income weatherization, energy planning, energy efficiency, transportation alternatives, and now has taken over a more significant management role with the agency. The Secretary has over 30 years of public and private sector experience, including pollution control and energy systems planning. Prior to her stint with DEQ, Sushma has had various supervisory and deputy director roles in environmental consulting, and has a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So with that, I'd like to introduce Assistant Secretary Masemore.
Good morning, Nelle.
Good morning.
Welcome.
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
We do. There you are. I was just looking for you. It's easier to actually see somebody in this environment. So thank you very much for being with us today. As we've mentioned, there is a very significant transition going on within the energy industry, and how we position that in the best possible way to continue to attract both expanding and new economic development in the Carolinas becomes very important. But we have multiple people from lots of different perspectives with us today. So it may be helpful in different professional lines. It may be helpful to go back, and we'll use North Carolina as an example. In 2019, the governor announced EO 80. Can you talk a little bit about what that the executive order, what it outlined and the tenets, and sort of where we are in things currently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Now, I can start with the premise and the intent behind Executive Order 80. It was called North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and foster a clean energy economy. The purpose of Executive Order 80 was basically a follow-up on Governor Cooper's commitment to join the Paris Agreement as a climate alliance state. Right after the previous election, the U.S. backed out of the Paris Agreement, and several states formed an alliance called the Climate Alliance, and they agreed that individually each state would do its best to meet the Paris Agreement carbon reduction targets. And Governor Cooper, in his first few months, had announced such a commitment for North Carolina from his administration. And then after about 8 months to almost 10 months, there was a question as to what we were going to do in response to that agreement. And so the Executive Order 80 was developed to prepare an action-oriented strategy. And one component in the EO 80 was to develop a variety of climate as well as energy-related action plans, both on the power generation side as well as the transportation side and motor fleet vehicle side. So 4 of the cabinet agencies were charged to develop a clean energy plan, a clean energy transportation plan, a motor fleet plan, and a workforce assessment plan. And all of that now were completed in a year's time, and then following October 2019, each agency delivered their plans to the governor. We at DEQ were in charge of developing the clean energy plan, which we did with assistance from stakeholders across the state. And that really has formed the foundation and some of the groundbreaking work that has taken place in the last 2 years towards an evaluation of where we are, where we're headed, and what our options are, and what the cost and the technical feasibility of those options can be as we collectively work towards a net zero 2050 goal.
Great. The Governor Cooper, as well as the agency, and certainly now EPA Director Regan, had talked a lot about the relationship between economic development and energy, and especially the transition into a cleaner energy environment. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective that the agency and the administration has on that intersection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to go back to our inability to forecast accurately. No matter how well we do, we're always wrong. And energy sector is one of those that historically what we thought would happen 10 years ago is really not where things ended up being, and the same 20 years ago. But we do know certain things. We know that grid transformation in North Carolina and across the country is going to happen, and that in the next 3 to 10 years, we're going to be see a widespread transformation of the electric power sector, how fuel is supplied and delivered and used, as well as how transportation for light-duty vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles are actually implemented in terms of engine technologies and the mode of transportation. So we know that the technology evolution and the declining costs of individual components, as well as wholesale change in pricing, is also going to affect those decisions in the future. We know that fuel prices and other cost uncertainties will continue, but there are drivers that are going to affect the choices we make in the future. And some of those drivers are consumer preferences and practices that are demanded by the consumers. There are public interest goals related to sustainability and decarbonization that I mentioned. There are natural and physical threats, particularly in North Carolina, that challenges our questioning of how we rely on the infrastructure in the system in order to maintain our quality of life and in order to continue the business as we like to see. And then there are state and federal policies that are continually going to drive the energy sector in particular in the next decade. But one thing I like to say is that the forces and or momentum for that transformation is going to happen regardless of many of these drivers, because the factors that are influencing it, whether it be cost, whether it be consumer choice, whether it be technology, innovation, and choices, are all going towards a certain outcome. When you look at the Energy Information Administration's latest forecast, again, with the caveat of we can never forecast accurately, but it is a window into what is possible. The EIA 2021 forecast, which was released in August, prior to the election, prior to all that you've heard, as to the enormous amount of investments and policy changes that may occur at the federal level. That forecast pretty much said that renewables and natural gas will be the dominant sources of electric power generation in the country. And that before 2030, renewables will increase by a factor of twofolds, and that it'll surpass natural gas generation above 1,500 billion kilowatt hours. So according to their reference case, which is not looking at high or low prices for natural gas, but as predicted, that they're seeing a switch over between renewables and natural gas post 2030. Now, whether or not that happens sooner or later, the fact that these two resources and other choices will dominate choices we make within our state, North Carolina, but also other drivers that will affect our choices here. So I just, wanted to set the stage that this grid transformation is in works and will continue to work in our lifetime.
So with that being said, and I think you heard earlier, the top three things that commercial and industrial customers are looking for, whether they are new entrants into the Carolinas or existing part of our existing customer base, are very interested in costs and reliability. Pace will impact or could impact both of those. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts? You mentioned the federal as well as the state. There are alignment issues that may come up, and those of us both in utilities as well as the C&I customer base have concerns about how we manage costs through this transition. Can you give your perspective a little bit about how that can be checked along the way to allow for that innovation and technology development, but also create, there will be an uncertainty, and I think I will give you that, but where can we create a path or some certainty to allow those customers to feel comfortable here in North Carolina or new entrants on energy costs?
Yeah, one of the key core values that we identified in achieving our clean energy plan goals was affordability and price stability. And that includes both for residential ratepayers, but also for commercial industrial ratepayers. Now that is something that is always part of the equation, but also an important aspect towards planning. As I mentioned ahead, that transformation is going to happen. How we direct that transformation and to achieve the best outcome towards cost competitiveness so that we are at a level playing field with our adjoining states. All of those questions and planning and consideration of the best solutions, whether it's policy oriented and or planning ahead and evaluating what our options are in terms of choices, whether it be choices towards generation or transmission or distribution system investment planning. All of these choices result in direct impacts and indirect benefits as well as costs. So my thinking is that if we work together like we have in the past in North Carolina, collective thinking about what the pitfalls are, where those challenges exist, and then working through making North Carolina a great place to continue to do business, a great place for businesses to grow, and a great place for businesses to continue to start putting their operations here. If we provide not only the incentives, but the atmosphere for those dialogues and those conversations for values that they see importance. Many of those same companies are seeking the similar clean energy output and the ability to purchase, but also they want price competitiveness as well as reliability. And so sometimes people think that you can't have one without the other, but I believe that is the challenge of our time. There was a time when we were, in my generation, I'm sure everyone in this room knew that you cannot have economic progress without increasing energy costs. And not long ago, those two components were decoupled. And we have continued to increase the national GDP, the state SDP, while energy consumption and efficiency and other means have declined. So we did decouple in the 90s, in the early 2000s. And so as we move to the next decade and the next 20 years of planning for the transformation of the power grid, I think there's opportunity to be cost competitive, to create affordable and reliable power while we transition.
Thank you. Let's go back to the fuel sources that you mentioned. You mentioned obviously the twofold increase in renewables, and that can be multiple types of renewables. And you mentioned natural gas, and certainly the electric cooperatives believe natural gas will be part of our reliability equation for quite some time for the transition. But also, we rely certainly in the Southeast, but also in the Carolinas on nuclear as a non-emitting technology. What are your thoughts on that, including that in your portfolio of power generation moving forward, and perhaps the next step for nuclear moving forward?
Part of the Clean Energy Plan and the subsequent work that we did with stakeholders, and in fact, some of the regulatory policy work that we did, now it's really towards evaluating what resource options are available that gets us to an ultimate goals that we have as a state. So nuclear power, certainly at the central large scale level, provides us that zero emitting resources that is reliable and that is stable. But as we move forward into the future, the small modular nuclear and other advancements in those technologies will provide additional opportunities and choices. And some of them may be more costly, but the advantage of what we talked about earlier in reliability, as well as power quality and all those important aspects of consumer choices and consumer needs, are important in ensuring that the resources we pick for the future are representative of the path we want to forge forward. But I will say that we need to be thinking strategically and long term. We want to plan for resources that will last us, that would avoid short-term investments that could be stranded not too far into the future. So it is a challenge for regulators, for planners, for consumers, what that best makeup looks like. And I don't know whether we have a clear answer, but I think that we need to come up with a path that is not looking at 5-10 years, but more 30 years down the road and 50 years down the road, because many of these investment choices are not short-term investments. They will require us to look out with a vision for where we want to be and how to get there.
Well, I think you acknowledge something. This is a very capital-intensive industry. To be able to have that stability and planning long-term, don't disagree with that. And part of the word that keeps coming to my mind is how do we incorporate flexibility? And you mentioned choices earlier in your comments to allow that path to continue to evolve. We are a heavy research and development state. I think we need that room for that work and that innovation. A lot of the companies that are part of E4 are involved in those types of activities. What's your thought on that and opportunities down the road for longer term storage batteries or hydrogen, different types of technologies that we may be able to use to stabilize this transition over time?
One of the reasons I myself is in North Carolina is because of Research Triangle Park. I moved here over 30 years ago from Maryland because of the high-tech industry here. I think North Carolina has a knack for the next, what's next out there in terms of large-scale revolution in job creation. Whether initially it was furniture and textile, the transition well into pharmaceuticals and high-tech industry. There is a significant opportunity for technology innovation, deployment, and implementation related to the energy sector. And you mentioned battery storage, but I think really transportation, electrification is one area that North Carolina clearly is standing out. There's a race for capturing those kind of business opportunities and jobs, especially in the Southeast. Just this last 3 months, I have fielded some inquiries on companies that are interested in locating and expanding for battery storage devices, for engine components, for electric vehicles. And one of the things they ask is, how friendly is your state? What are your policies towards transportation electrification? So not only are these companies looking for an educated workforce in the universities that feed the needs of those innovating technology companies, but they're also looking for places where they can deploy and increase their market share. And so being in a state that also recognizes the use of those technologies is, I think, just as important as it is in incentivizing and bringing those businesses. One other statistics I wanted to lay out is as of between 2012 and July 2020, over $2 billion in grid assets were approved by utilities commissions across the country. And an additional $400 billion were in queue that were either filed or were under consideration. And when you look at the amount of investments that utilities and or public utilities commissions are evaluating in terms of planning for transportation electrification, it is going to be a major, I don't know what to call it, disruptor, but a change in the way we transport ourselves. But not only that, but how we power those vehicles. It will have to come from the power grid. And so the demand on the grid will change. And as we put more requirements on that grid to be cleaner, that will translate into cleaner transportation for the rest of the country. So, yeah.
Yeah, to go back to, and you mentioned the decoupling and actually a decrease in energy use and going specifically to electricity based on your comments on transportation, although there may be other fuels for those vehicles as well. One of the things I wanted to mention was the idea of beneficial electrification, or electrifying more things that actually will decrease carbon emissions. There's a role there, and it actually could increase electricity production overall, but perhaps through other generation resources. There has been some discussion in policy on the federal level as well as the state level. What are your thoughts on that, and what that looks like moving forward is another tool to decrease carbon emitting practices in the states, both in the Carolinas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beneficial electrification, whether you look at it in the residential sector or industrial sector or commercial, we've known, at least as a state, that energy efficiency and transferring of certain types of processes and equipments to electrification can provide cost savings to the user, to the building operator. We in North Carolina, our state governmental buildings have overall achieved over 30% in energy reduction since 2002. Our universities have achieved over 35%, and they're on their way to perhaps as much as 40% by 2025. And all of these cost savings has resulted in tremendous amount of taxpayer benefits, but also operational feasibility, things that we thought were not even imaginable 5 years ago are being implemented. there's still room for changes. Our buildings still need better lighting, better controls, HVAC improvements. But electrification at a larger scale from changing from certain types of fuel intensive processes to electrified motors, all of those are in the realm of possibilities. And if you look at the Biden climate plan and the infrastructure bill, there are a significant amount of investments geared towards that energy efficiency goal for all three sectors of the economy. It was one of the key recommendation in the clean energy plan that we mentioned earlier. We are working with our university partners and other organizations to support that in the residential scale, from hot water heaters to HVAC systems, but also with commercial buildings and as I mentioned, in schools, K through 12 schools and state buildings. One other thing I wanted to highlight is our team, as a part of this clean energy plan, was asked to look at a different framework for a CPACE program, commercial property assessed clean energy program, that is more successful and that can be utilized statewide. The legislation we had for the last 7-8 years did not result in a single CPACE project across the country, across our state. And there are 24, 25 states that invest in hundreds of millions of dollars on PACE type of projects. So we have worked with a team of stakeholders all over, from banking institutions to developers to utilities and research partners. And we have produced a program design that has now culminated into a Senate bill and a bipartisan-led bill in North Carolina. So what may come out of this is an opportunity, if it gets passed, is an opportunity to create a framework for energy efficiency, clean energy, as well as resilient building improvement projects and programs for commercial operations. And I personally believe that there is tremendous opportunity for the commercial building sector to be more energy efficient, to decarbonize whatever is driving your interest. It is the only sector, when you look at the energy consumption level, it is the only sector in the entire economy that has seen an increase in intensity, while every other sector, whether you look at ag, power sector, transportation, has declined in terms of its energy intensity. So I believe that there is significant opportunity for cost savings and technology deployment.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I think that's one thing as far as the commercial and industrial sector specifically are always watching their pennies when it comes to energy, and understandably so. It's a large input cost for them. A lot of what you've mentioned is significant transition, but also significant capitalization in the billions, which you mentioned going on all across the country. How do we, there's been a fair amount of conversation that the C&I customer base is concerned about the socialization of some of the societal benefits that the state and the federal government may be looking for through that transition. And the different rate classes are particularly interested in taking care of their things, but not necessarily a goal as a whole. How does the state, or if you want to speak just for you or for the agency, balance those interests moving forward? Because we're talking about a lot of money and a lot of change. And if that's not managed well, it can get a little dicey, and we could have perhaps some retraction in the state and the C&I world. And none of us want that, including the administration. So how do we balance those interests?
Yeah. Luckily we're not involved in those decision makings, but we do understand at the planning level and at the policy level, how those decisions ultimately affect the consumers and the ratepayers, whether it be residential or commercial or industrial customers. I think now that is really where regulatory policy and regulatory programs really need to have that relook. You're right that if this change is going to happen, the question is will the change happen with a direction where limited input is provided without broad understanding of the consequences and the benefits of it? Or will it be a collective planning process where everyone has a say in what that future holds? Part of that could result in winners and losers, but that is really not the intent. It is fair and equal share of the cost of the system across all ratepayers. As you mentioned, the C&I customers feel that. I think many residential ratepayers feel that on their side. So where is the balance? I think our Utilities Commission will be challenged to ensure that the cost of these infrastructure upgrades and the benefits and the profit that come with it are equally shared. There is opportunity for the system planning and the implementation to be more efficient than it has been in the past. And there is an opportunity for the collective cost sharing of that efficiency and that operational improvement. Many states are currently evaluating those regulatory reform options because it is not just a cost component. There are significant improvements in savings that can result. And there are model states and model regulatory programs that have been either implemented or has been recently been implemented with that purpose. So I think we're not saying we copy and paste that, but I think we should be open to those innovation and those alternative ways of rate making, planning, and ultimate implementation that is in the best interest of all of our ratepayers.
Okay, thank you. David, I know we've gotten some questions, and I can't see them from where I am right now, by the way I have my screen up, but are there a couple of questions that we may want to ask of our new Assistant Secretary here?
Nell, I'm going to give you a review of the topics that have come through. There have been a lot.
Okay.
So just kind of jot notes, and you can decide where to go with it. I think you may have already touched a little bit on the inclusion of nuclear within the no carbon portfolio. And there was some pretty good discussion about the issue with nuclear being more perception as opposed to actual risk, and that post Chernobyl there were studies done found that really mental health and psychosomatic risks were the biggest outfall in addition to the direct radiation from that accident. A lot of questions about how do we overcome the fear of nuclear if we're going to include it within the portfolio. And then we move on, and there's some questions regarding when we strive for a lesser carbon footprint, are we inadvertently picking up some other environmentals like wastes from new nuclear technologies, battery manufacturing, so on? What about the geographic footprint? And then another question with regard to our dependence upon electricity, as we begin to focus in on depend increasingly upon one energy source, it becomes increasingly risky with the ability of others to disrupt our use of it. So there's kind of a compendium of what's been in the chat, and it's been pretty active.
Okay. Well, I do think on reliability and in ensuring sort of where the role of natural gas and the time frames for that, and perhaps there will be newer technologies to capture methane. Any thoughts on that? I know there's some federal activity, Sushma, that's going on, and some R&D there. Any thoughts on that time frame? There are those that are critics of natural gas that want to shut it down sooner rather than later. But as a utility, I have to speak that we have concerns about that on reliability. So what are your thoughts around natural gas or other types of energy resources that can be used in the portfolio moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think natural gas, if you look at I don't have I have a chart, but I'm not going to share it right now. Um, Part of the EIA's forecast shows that how much new capacity is added in the future, and we will continue to add natural gas capacity in the short term while many of the coal-fired power plants retire. That is certain. The question is, as we in the presence of federal policies in order to address a clean power grid and the desire to reduce carbon emissions, natural gas will eventually need to accompany um, uh, sequestration as part of a technology solution. And when you look at natural gas, it's often seen as a paired with some control, some ability to reduce the carbon emissions from those power plants. One thing is for sure, the last 20% of what we call 100% renewables or 100% clean targets is going to be our most challenging part. Where that last 20% comes from by 2050. And you saw the Biden's plan for the power sector is a much aggressive target by 2035. They're slating that to be 100% clean. So last 20%, I believe, from an engineer's perspective, is really where technology innovation, alternative options will need to be considered. And whether it's natural gas or nuclear or hydrogen fuel, all of those are really the challenges for the next decade for us to figure it out. But in order to address the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that science is telling us that we need to keep that goal in mind, any fossil fuel we use, we must have a way to sequester and or make use of that CO2 as best as we can.
We've had a number of questions regarding hydrogen. You're a chemical engineer. What are your thoughts? Obviously, it is getting a lot of play in Europe. There's a lot of conversation about it, some demonstration projects. A decade isn't very long from an innovation and research development standpoint. What are your thoughts on a future for hydrogen here in the United States?
Yeah, I read that, and I've also been excited about it. I think that the day when we have a bullet train here in North Carolina would be awesome. It's really, as you can see, I'm from India, and I came here with my father years ago. He was an engineer, and he came to America for opportunity. And I think, I tell my kids that we are the land of innovation and the technology, revolution. And hydrogen, whether it be clean transportation, or even the next generation of power generation technologies, that is up to us to embrace and lead the world in. If we don't, there are many countries that are ahead of the game. They're putting enormous resources in these research and development, innovation and deployment in order to maintain our nation's competitive edge, to keep good jobs and also create opportunities so that people want to come here and build this country in a positive way. All those things result in looking at all options on the table as long as they support the public good and the public interest as we get to the next 30 years, which are so critical for our future generations.
Let's end today with a little bit on resiliency. but I'm going to kind of hit it at a little bit of a different angle as opposed to just from, for instance, weather events, which is certainly gets a lot of play within the Carolinas, understandably, with ice storms and hurricanes. Something else that, as we modify our grid and more work is done on transmission and distribution, and certainly retail distribution is where a lot of the action is going to be with distributed energy. There's also a lot of thought of a potential disruptor on the cyber side, because all of this is connected and it's all through computers and microchips. How do we manage the reliability and resiliency side from the cyber side as much as we do from fuel or other typical things that we've worried about in the past? Any thoughts on that, or has there been conversations within the administration on protecting our grid from that perspective, or our pipelines?
I think this is pretty real. We live it every day. In my new role, I've heard of 2 incidences when more recently in the last couple of weeks where we had hackers get into our public water supply and the computer systems that support it. It is part of our new world, and it is going to continue to be challenging. I have not been involved in any of that, so I can't tell you, but we have discussed this with the Energy Policy Council. We have discussed this with the broader, what we call vulnerability assessment of the power grid, where you have both climate and non-climate stressors that are going to affect the reliability and resiliency of the grid. So as we are asking questions on not only what storms and high winds do to the grid, we also need to ask those same questions as to what those cyber attack related vulnerabilities exist in our grid. The DOE has an office that is really focusing on both of these components, and they are working with states. We have several projects with them that we're looking at resiliency. Part of what we want to do is integrate some of those concepts with 2 parts of our emergency management programs. One is our hazard mitigation plans that is prepared by the State Division of Emergency Management, and the other is through the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience that looks at infrastructure as a recovery support function. Both of these programs are designed to look at both the hazards, but also the preparation and response associated with disasters. We're trying to get these both climate and non-climate related stressors into resilience planning through what we call vulnerability assessment. I understand Duke Energy is in the process of doing its vulnerability assessment and creating an evaluation of all their assets. And I think by including those climate and non-climate stressors into that analysis, we should capture the physical threats that you just mentioned.
Great. Well, I thank you so much for your time this morning. Appreciate the conversation. We touched on multiple topics, and we appreciate what you do on behalf of North Carolina. We know you talk to your counterparts in South Carolina, and so we appreciate the conversations that go on beyond North Carolina as well. But we certainly, as a North Carolinian, look forward to continuing to have a competitive environment and a welcoming environment for all of the citizens, as well as our C&I customer base here in North Carolina.